Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar today, looking at this idea of what influence ownership has on levels of accountability within businesses and teams and for individuals. It's been really interesting, and it's been good to see the level of interest that there's been in this topic as people registered for the webinar, which suggests to me both that it's an area that businesses and individuals might be having some struggles with, and that are coming to L&D and HR for potential solutions. So hopefully what we're going to go through today will give you some ideas and pointers as to how you might look at it within your own business. And we talked about it being a paradox in the invites that we gave you. And the paradox, I suppose, that we're going to explore today is why is it that when businesses and teams start from a place of sort of aggressively driving high levels of accountability for their people, why is it that often actually achieves the opposite result rather than achieving better outcomes? So that's what we're going to go into today, is looking at those two areas of ownership and accountability. What drives those? What results do you get depending on where you start from on that spectrum? Looking at how motivation might underpin that. And at the end, sort of showing you a framework or a tool that we've come up with that can give you a good way of navigating through that process. So just a few admin points before we start. We're recording the webinar, so should you need to leave early, you've already registered, so we'll be sending the full recording out at the end of the webinar. Again, if you wanted to share that with anybody else. And we've also enabled the type chat function on the software, so you should see on the right hand side of your screen. So we're hoping that we'll cover all your questions as we go through. If you feel like you've got questions you want to raise, do type those in. We'll be able to keep track of those. If I think we're going to cover them in what we're going to discuss, then I won't answer them there and then. But if we get to the end and there's still some questions that haven't been answered, we'll pull those together at the end. So please do, if you've got specific questions, type those in and send them across to us. Right, so moving on to the presentation. So the two of us on the webinar today. So I'm Neil Kimberley. I'm the Programs Director here at Farscape. And I'm pleased today to be joined by Will Carson, who's one of our senior associates, to talk us through this topic. And in terms of the agenda, I've sort of outlined it there for you, but there's sort of two or three areas really that we're going to cover it at sort of a headline level. What is it about ownership, and how is that different to accountability, and why would you use that as the start point to drive results in an organization as opposed to starting with accountability? How does motivation and commitment underpin that, if that's a model and approach that you want to use? And then finally, then looking at what's a tool or a method of working through this process within the business that's practical and hands-on that you could actually tangibly do if that was a way you wanted to look at it. So moving on to the presentation, so introducing Will. So morning, Will, and thanks for joining us today.
Morning.
Just as a question to kick us off then, I suppose one thing that's interested in me, and I know that we've spoken about this a lot sort of outside of this webinar, but I'm interested to know what is it specifically about this topic of ownership and accountability that's led you to look into it in such depth over the last few years?
Thanks, Neil. Good morning, everybody. Good to be here with you on this webinar. So for me, my background is both in working in business as a manager and as a leader over a number of years, and I've been involved in the commercial elements of helping businesses to grow and helping their people to grow within the business. My previous background 25 odd years ago was as an actor, so I trained and I worked as an actor for 7 or 8 years, and it has fed into the work that I do in the commercial environment. So now I work as an executive coach, as a team coach, and I work with Neil writing and designing and delivering programs that are very much focused on helping people to develop themselves more than they are about creating distinct strategies for particular businesses. And if there's one thing I've learned is that there is a creative drive through most businesses and most people, but it's often untapped. And the idea of ownership in a creative sense is being able to really define what do I do, why do I do it, how do I do it, and being really closely attached to that decision making in order that the experience that you then have is one that you own and that you're comfortable with, and it's something that you have generated from yourself. And that's as distinctly opposed to a business telling you, this is what you need to do, this is why you need to do it, this is how you need to do it, and by the way, we're going to hold you accountable from day one. So whilst some similar outcomes might be achieved, the methodology by which you can help people develop personal ownership that results in personal accountability, it's putting different facets in advance of the accountability, if you like. So choosing the order in which you go about exploring that.
Right.
And so that, if we move on to looking at some of the basics around ownership, for me, ownership really starts, as it does for everybody, when we're a kid, and we really clearly have a relationship with what we own, why we own it, and when we own it. You know, I've got a couple of kids, and both of them come back from school, and when they're pleased with what's happened and they're pleased with the outcome, they're pleased with the experience. I did this. Look, Dad, I did this. And they hold it up and whatever it is, and they really want to be clearly associated with it. They want to show that they owned both the thing that they did and the way it came about and the results of it, and it's something they're often proud of, and it brings fulfillment for them. At the same time, you get kids that are quite curious, so you know that's a real defining feature of being a child is I might be interested in something, just let me have a little look and just check things out. And then always we have the it wasn't me, I didn't do it, it just fell off the table, my hand did it. Kids are very clear about when they don't want to be owning something, owning an experience, and they just dissociate themselves from it, and they're quite blunt with it, and that's why we find it quite funny at times. Unfortunately, when that happens in business, it can have some deeper or wider implications, and it can make for quite an uncomfortable experience. A lot of people don't really find that they have the opportunity to just stand up and say, I did this, and for it to be celebrated, because a lot of businesses don't celebrate in that way. So looking at how people work in teams, one way of thinking about that is whether they're high functioning teams or dysfunctional teams. Now, both dysfunctional teams, both dysfunctional teams and high functioning teams produce things. So they can both produce levels of performance. In fact, some teams that are dysfunctional can be quite high performing in their way. But the idea of ownership really supports, at a base level, the manner in which the teams come together, the manner in which an individual manages their own career, their own development, their own learning, and their own experience at work. And so the high-functioning team on the left-hand side, a Formula One pit lane team, you've got a lot of people there doing different things. They've got different responsibilities, they're accountable for different things, different levels of skill, and they need to perform at an extremely high level for themselves, for them individually in their groups, and as a team. They need to be incredibly flexible, need to be agile, aware of what's going on, but they're also interdependent with each other. And that's a critical feature of a high-functioning team. On the right-hand side, a not dissimilar situation for many people in many businesses, people sat around tables having meetings that nobody understands the purpose of the meeting and not being able to agree a way forward. And often there's a clash. One person wants to own one thing, somebody else wants to own something else. And the ownership might be the emotional sense of the meeting. It might be something very clearly work-related. So we have these very different experiences in a work situation that, we all started off in the world loving stuff when we wanted to own it. And as adults, we get into a situation where we're being held accountable, but we don't know how to move forward.
Will, just on the quick question there then. So in these two teams that you're sort of displaying here in these two pictures, in relation to ownership then, what's going on? What's different between what's going on in those two scenarios?
So in terms of ownership, on the left-hand side, be it a Formula One or be it something in a potentially more mainstream business, you've got people who've explored both what they do, why they do it, how they do it, how it relates to other people, how other people perceive them, and they square that up with, well, what's my intention? And they feed that into, this is what I'm going to do next. So they consider at a number of different levels, both the practical side, both the relationship side, and then the psychological side of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they are working with other people. So they're not just an entity in themselves. They're understanding the impact that has on the rest of the world around them. On the right hand side is you potentially got a team or a group of people who've been tasked with achieving a particular result, and they've got different ways of going about it, but they're not finding a way of A, communicating it with each other, or B, finding some satisfaction in the fact they might have to do it in a way they don't want to do it. So the functional nature of people in a room in business is a critical element as to whether or not results are achieved. Now, where this touches on the accountability and ownership debate is that the people on the right-hand side are going to be held equally accountable for their actions as the people on the left-hand side. But the people on the left-hand side, distinctly look like they're going to achieve a much higher, better outcome, and likely be accountable for it, wanting to be accountable for it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I suppose the difference there is that through all the things you said about the way that they've gone about exploring what's needed, how they're going to do it, what it means to them, what the purpose is, they want to be accountable. They're willing to hold their hand up rather than being told they are accountable.
Yeah, a dysfunctional team that feels it's not been supported by other team members or the business at large, knowing that it's accountable for results, knowing it's accountable for any number of different business metrics. If that doesn't gel with them, if it doesn't feel like something that they have authored or they've owned or they've been listened to, that's an uncomfortable experience, and I would suggest that has an absolutely negative impact on the quality of experience and likely the quality of results as well.
Okay.
If we look at the relationship between ownership and accountability, I think there are some features of this that are on a spectrum. And it's not that accountability is bad and ownership is good. That's not the point at all. They are both relevant and both necessary. But like everything, in terms of personal development, it's going to be relevant to the individual or to the team as to the order in which you bring these things about and the manner in which you bring them about as well. So if you look on the right-hand side and say, well, if the business is focused on accountability and it uses accountability as the clearest narrative in the business, often that can be perceived as and experienced as, authority from the business, extrinsically motivating them. So this is the reward you will get, but this is the reward you won't get if you don't achieve it. We're driving performance. It's about results and goals being the main feature. We're solving problems and we're looking to create high performance teams based on evidence and measurability. Excuse me. And the business is doing the definition here. It's the one that's setting out the stall. It's the one that's setting out the expectations, and holding people accountable. People in a position of authority from the top of the business to the bottom of the business. On the left-hand side is ownership, which is personal input. Now, that doesn't mean it's only derived from the individual. Businesses can absolutely nurture personal input because it can be interested. It can create the environment. It can create the conditions that says this is a critical part of how we operate our business.
Yeah.
So how do you create autonomous thinking, feeling, and behaving? How do you nurture intrinsically motivated drive within the business, within teams, within individuals? How do you make sure that you're an emotionally intelligent organization and that emotional intelligence becomes emotional literacy for individuals? How do you celebrate personal achievement, make this engaging, creating high-functioning people in teams, not just high-performance people in teams? And how do you help what happens in the business to be defined by the individual as well as being defined by the business?
So out of interest, well, having worked with teams and businesses yourself on this area, what do you think it is that typically draws businesses and attracts businesses to starting from a place of accountability as a business input rather than what you just suggested on the left?
I think it often feels like there's less risk. If the business starts with accountability, it's creating the definition. It's creating both the benchmark or the aspirational goal. And that, of course, might be driven from shareholders, quite likely, given that their drive is to increase the value of the business, increase the return from the business. And if the business narrative is one of, these are the targets and we have to achieve those targets come hell or high water, it's an easy option to say we've decided who's going to be accountable for what, and we will hold you accountable for it, whether you like it or not.
Mm.
Because getting involved in all the questions around autonomy and emotional intelligence and being personally engaging and high functioning, those are things that are much harder to measure. And you ask the question, and you might find that different people have different needs. Different teams have different needs. So you're opening up a whole raft of things that potentially you don't have the time, the money, the effort, or the interest in engaging with. Well, for me, that is a bit of a fallacy, because actually, if you give people the opportunity to explore what matters to them, people are generally pretty good at explaining that and working out if they get some of this, they don't get some of that. That's okay. But the fact that they've been heard in itself is critical.
Mm.
So if we look at the way that accountability comes about as a familiar start point in business, this is potentially a set of descriptors that are both, what's going on there? Bear with me a second, the PowerPoint's gone a bit. There we are. A set of descriptors that sometimes the business pushes out, and sometimes it's how the business is interpreted. So it would be very familiar in the businesses that I work with, both global businesses and SMEs, for targets to be clearly defined within the business. Results, we're driving through towards results. We have high expectations. We want this to be predictable success. At the same time, people may well feel judged, from the outset. This is what your expectations are. I have a certain level of skill or expertise, and I feel like the way you're putting this out is judging me. People may feel that there is a degree of fear in that. The fear of not achieving can be a strong motivator. So these things absolutely drive a particular feel within a business, and they set a particular tone within a business, and that can be quite stern, it can be quite businesslike, and it can be directly attributed to performance goals and a hierarchical controlling environment. What that then potentially translates into is that there's a starting point for accountability. Okay, people, this is what you're responsible for. Go make it happen. And that message is wrapped up in different ways, and sometimes it's a bit softer and sometimes a bit firmer. But ostensibly, that's what a business says. This is, you've got a job role, you've got a function, there's an expectation, there's targets. Go do. And if there is anything along the way that means that that's a challenge for people or teams, there's potentially some kickback. Whether this is actually expressed in the business or not is going to affect it in different ways. But a lot of people may have their own interpretation of, if we don't get there in the way that was demanded of us, what are they saying? You didn't support me. It's not realistic. I don't have the resources. I did what I was told and no more. I don't really care. And I don't really care is often not going to be expressed in business, but you're going to see it in the faces of people. You're going to see it in the style in which they work, their emotional intelligence. If you turn that around and look at ownership being the start point, as opposed to accountability being the start point, you've got a whole different set of criteria. If we tell you that we care, if we are here to nurture the people in the business, if this is, if emotion is as important as the business goals, if autonomy is important, if we are a compassionate business, if we're focused on you and you're focused on self, then that's a good facet of the business. This is a very different start point, but it's not necessarily going to be the job in hand. It's going to be how you engage with the job in hand. It sends a very different message, and it opens up a very, very different discussion, with a view to ownership being a very different start point. So we just simply reverse this and say, if we've got ownership as a start point, which is a series of questions, a series of expectations, and some observations from the business, then what you get to is the end point, which is your 5-year-old child with homework in hand going, I did this, and this is how I did it. And when we move from being the 5-year-old into the 35-year-old in business, if your people are standing up saying, I did this and this is how I did it, and it went well, or it went badly, if they are comfortable and capable and articulate enough to be able to say what went well and what went badly and own it, then you've got an emotionally intelligent workforce. Then you've got people who are absolutely prepared to be attached to where we started, what we did, and what the outcome was.
Mm. Can I just take you back to the previous slide and ask you a question here, Will? So
Yeah.
you've got sort of, it's interesting, creativity, innovation, and risk on that slide, which increasingly are terms that businesses are looking to develop, and they want agile leaders who are more creative and innovative and are willing to take risks. I'm interested what the link is between ownership and those three words.
So in terms of the idea of risk in business, risk is often something that businesses want to mitigate because it implies if we do something that doesn't work, we potentially failed. I think there's a direct relationship between creativity, innovation, and risk. If you want people to be creative and innovative, that's a mindset as much as anything else, as well as being practical.
Yeah.
And if what you're prepared to do is say, look, we will support you in owning the experience you have, and we understand that there is a risk in it, but risk doesn't mean failure. Risk means that you've explored different ways, and some of them, the risk was some of them were going to produce fantastic results, and some of the outcomes were not going to be fantastic. But it's not a failure. What it is an experience where we can get broader, deeper, further reaching understanding of what we're going to do next.
Yeah.
And so, you effectively, you reimagine risk to be something that is a way of supporting creativity and innovation that people look at as an asset rather than an impediment.
Yeah, great. No, it's just interesting because it's something that we're continually asked about, how can we engender more creativity and innovation within the business? And I think that's a very valid point, that creating an environment where people can own that experiment, as it were, and as you say, that there isn't as great a degree of fear of failure, then that can only help, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on how people view it, different lenses to consider how people engage with ownership. And depending on the type of person you are, your experience, maybe your age, or your psychometric profiling, what your personality is like, you may attach yourself to ownership in very different ways. So some people clearly want psychological ownership of what they do, how they do it, when they do it, why they do it. So they want to know that it being in the moment, being consciously aware, their attitude, other people's attitude, is something to be engaged with rather than something to be pushed away. Psychologically, am I safe? Is this predictable? If I'm managing this, I did this. These psychological elements of ownership are absolutely critical if they are important for the individual. Again, emotional ownership. If people feel that they're both supported in emotional ownership and they are unable to be emotionally literate because the organization is emotionally literate and is engaged with having discussions about things that go well or things that don't go so well, then for some people that start point for ownership is critical if it's emotional. And again, practically, what do people do? What are the relationships they have? How do they practice? How do they repeat? How do they hone their behavior? So recognizing where your start point is and what journey you tend to navigate through is, I think, a useful part of the discussion for anybody moving into, okay, if we're going to own the experience, we're going to own the start, middle, and end point. What matters to you? And so you, for instance, you could use some of these things and more to stimulate a discussion with a team or with some, with individuals in a business, and say, what matters to you, and where's the start point for you in terms of your considerations around how you own this project, for instance.
So when you've gone through this process and looked at this sort of paradox with teams and businesses before, what typically do you think they find difficult in starting from a point of ownership as opposed to accountability?
What would they find difficult?
Why do they find that more challenging from starting from a place of accountability?
Because they've got to generate their own thoughts and insights and align them with the business.
Right.
It can be much easier, especially if it's the familiar way that businesses work, to have the business make that definition for them. So if the business sets out the targets, the goals, the outcomes, and assigns particular, roles and people and functions to teams and individuals, and identifies the measurability of that, then the accountability is effectively defined by the individual, by the organisation. Sorry, maybe a bit of negotiation with the individual, but it comes from the business. If you're getting the individual to contribute in a significant and meaningful way as to what they want, need, and desire to own as part of this process, and the business is receptive, that's great, because then you have something that's contracted, something that is where there's alignment and congruence between the business and the individual. But if the organization's got to want that to happen, so all the leadership and the management, the structures have got to want to make that happen and to support that for it to happen. Otherwise, you get people just going, I want to own this, and nobody listens, and they learn very quickly that if the business isn't interested, go back to business as usual, which is tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
If I want to. Yeah. So given that can be challenging for some business and teams to find a way of starting from that place of ownership instead of accountability, I mean, what practically can managers, directors, businesses do to start to engender a culture that supports ownership?
The start point, I think, is understanding motivation and commitment. So motivation, something that most people are familiar with. A couple of ways to think about motivation. Are you motivated towards things, or are you motivated away from things? Another way to think about that is what are the intrinsic and the extrinsic motivators. But motivation in itself is the energy. Right. If people's drive is to just do the minimum, just to do, what can I get away with? And if the business has said these are your targets, this is what we'll hold you accountable for. If you can get away with doing that, no more, bingo, you've fulfilled your contract. But if the motivation is deeper than that and is more meaningful to the individual, people can produce some phenomenal results over and above expectations that they have or the business has. If you look at the idea of extrinsic motivation, I think it would be fair to say in a lot of businesses that is a huge drive, because it's a thing that's more easily defined. And let's be fair, we don't just go to work for the love of it. We go there to earn money. We go there for reward. We also go there for recognition. We go there for bettering ourselves, for progression. We want to move up the corporate ladder potentially. In terms of extrinsic motivators, they can be seen sometimes as either the carrot and or the stick. So the you're fired syndrome, or you're not getting the reward or the bonus, or you're not going to move up. That can be a stick. That can be a negative extrinsic motivator that people try and balance out with the positive extrinsic motivators. But the extrinsic is good only to a degree, because it doesn't touch as much of the internal ownership and motivation as intrinsic motivators do. So here's I quite like this as a way of trying to understand what contributes towards the purpose that fuels individuals. And I think it is many and varied, and probably more than this combination of different features. But the fact that you love it has got to have something to do with it. And if you don't love it, are you great at it? And if you don't love it, does the world need it? And that gives you some drive and some passion and some purpose. You're paid to do it at the bottom there. Obviously, we know that, but it fits in with other things as well. There is an overlay with other features of what it means to do your role in your particular organization. If you don't engage in this discussion about what really drives people intrinsically, personally, I think you're missing out on the biggest drive that any individual or any team has. Because if they do it with an internal drive, an internal motivation, people can achieve and develop in ways that you could only dream of, compared to let me as the business owner set the agenda and me tell you what you're accountable for. Then people are just doing what they can get away with or what's expected of them. This is where people do more than is expected, I think.
So would it be true to say then that businesses could argue about them? Well, if these are intrinsic motivators, then that's purely for the individual to find what can we do that can influence that?
And that's exactly the point. If you wait for people to simply find their intrinsic motivators, they may never find them, or they may sit with a very narrow band of those intrinsic motivators. I've got to love this, and if I don't love it, then nothing happens. Well, if you could help people develop that so that they could love it and they could also do stuff that they find uncomfortable or difficult, that would be brilliant, because then they could be self-learning. They could manage their way through difficult processes, through difficult relationships, challenging conversations. And that's the bit that, I was running a program last week on helping people to develop their skills at having challenging conversations. And the idea wasn't to stop other people being challenging. The idea around the program was to help other people learn how to be challenging in a constructive way. For most of the people on the program, it's deeply uncomfortable and they don't feel skilled at it, and they feel that there's a risk in terms of not getting it right. But when they practiced it, the skills, the techniques, the emotional intelligence, the conversations that are difficult for them, and they find out that they can do it, the empowerment they feel in terms of, I've got this nailed, I've got the skills, I understand the behaviors and the emotions required to make this happen. That then intrinsically motivates them because they're not relying on anybody else other than themselves, and they have the right resources to be able to go and do those difficult things.
Yeah.
Where I think that lead.
Sorry, go on.
I mentioned, go on. What was your question?
I was just going to say, because you mentioned before earlier on, when you started talking about motivation, that how that was linked to commitment. So I was just interested to know how is that linked?
So the motivation often feels like something personal or something business related, and is often future driven. And we look at, I'm motivated towards something or away from something. It can be quite close to home, but it often extends over and beyond that. Commitment is much more in the moment. And commitment is about being able to choose to do something that you want to do, that you don't want to do, that you love or you hate, or is necessary for somebody else, but you commit yourself to something. But it's hard to commit to things if it doesn't sit in a wider context. So just committing to turn up to work, even though you hate it, is hard work, and people fall off that wagon all the time. Committing to turn up to do a job that you find difficult or with difficult people, if that is aligned to a farther reaching motivation, then it's a different prospect altogether. We were talking about this earlier, and I was mentioning that I worked with a coach who coaches the Hungarian water polo team, which is their national sport as it happens. And he joined them in the late 80s when they'd been failing for years. And he took them to 3 Olympic gold medals. And we had a discussion around exactly this, which really sparked my interest in the difference between motivation and the commitment. And he said quite simply, yeah, we were all motivated. Absolutely. We wanted to win a gold medal, but nobody had any idea about how to turn that into commitment. What did that mean on a daily basis, on a weekly basis? What did that mean in terms of the quality of the relationships between the team, in terms of what they would and wouldn't do? And it was only when they fleshed out the commitments, and that boiled down to, so this is what the next 3 years looks like, did they actually work out who needed to be in the team? I quite like this as a not real definition of commitment, but I think it probably should be. Staying loyal to what you said you were going to do long after the mood you said it in has left. And if you can do that, I think that lends a sense of resilience and rigor to businesses that many people struggle to find.
So I guess obviously you and I discussed this before in preparation for this webinar, but I guess if I was sitting where all our sort of attendees are listening to all this, it goes, yeah, okay, it all makes sense. So I understand the difference between ownership and accountability. I can see, that it's a spectrum. We're not saying that one's either good nor bad. They sit on a spectrum, and yes, we know there are lots of different models of motivation. But I guess I'd be at the point of saying, so what? What am I going to practically do with these 3 terms within a business to enable us to be better at following projects through or achieving better results? If we're very much at the accountability end of the spectrum at the moment, how do I practically move us as an organisation further down the other end towards ownership?
Indeed, and excuse me, and that's the question that most individuals and businesses come to me with, over the last 10 or 15 years, is how do we turn this into something that is a useful way of going about developing? So this is our simple explanation as to how you can do that. So this isn't a model that produces a particular result. This is effectively a tool or an instrument, if you like. And it's something that I use with team coaching and individual coaching. I also use it for with organizations when they are looking at strategy, when they're looking at understanding how to set targets for the future, and try and drive through understanding from top to bottom of the business. What this does is essentially help individuals, teams, or businesses, or all three, create a narrative that they can all relate to. So you're using the same catalyst, if you like. So, for instance, if I develop some thoughts around what I'm going to do over the next 6 months in terms of my personal development, how I'm going to go about doing my work using this tool, if somebody else has a discussion with me in the business, and they've also been doing some development using this tool, we can have a conversation using the same reference point. And that, I think, is critical, because I've witnessed so many businesses having conversations they think are linked up across the business, but are fundamentally fueled by different needs, different strategies, different tools, different models, different reference points. And trying to find alignment, I mean, that's a job in itself. That's days worth of work. Whereas if you have a common reference point, a common catalyst or stimulus, that can create agility within an organization like nothing I've come across. And so, quite simply, this is a way of focusing on different facets, if you like, of experience in order to generate ownership of what happens next. The questions that sit underneath these 6 different facets, starting from action, which is the most granular, if you like, is what are you going to do? And then the plan, which is also what is the plan? What does that mean we're going to engage in? Strategy is the how do we do that? And the purpose is why am I, or why are we as a team going to do that? And the outcome are the results that we're looking to achieve individually, as a team, as a business. And the reputation is the perception that the people around us have. Reputation isn't something we choose. Reputation is something that we receive from other people. Their perception is their reality. We flesh that out a little bit, just a little bit of extra description around those. Actions is your commitments to making it come alive. So the plan is, what are the practical steps? How do we make it happen as a strategy? Why? What's the motivation towards the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And what are the results that you can measure? And then reputation is everyone else's view of you, good, bad, or ugly.
Out of interest, when you work with teams or in organizations, do you, in terms of these 6 different facets that you've just described, do you notice patterns as to where businesses and teams tend to gravitate to in terms of the way they operate on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that sometimes businesses are more focused on the top 3. So if you were going to look at reputation, outcome, and purpose, sometimes it's easy for businesses to do that. They're very concerned about their reputation, their external reputation, sometimes their internal reputation, what the market's reputation of them is, stakeholders' reputation, what the outcomes and the results, of course, that's going to measure profitability, success, remuneration, etc., etc. And the purpose, I think lots of businesses like to think they know what their purpose is, but actually they just dump their purpose in the outcome box. Our purpose is to make these cars, make great cars. And actually, if the outcome is great cars, then we can measure whether or not they're great. What's the purpose that underpins it? What's the motivation for making great cars? I think those 2 things can get blended in with each other. So often businesses find it really easy to focus on those things, and people within the business then just have to subscribe to what the business's view of those things is. And then, excuse me. And then the bottom half is often more personal. So me and my actions, what am I doing on a daily basis? And how am I navigating my way through different component parts of that? What is the plan that's in place for me? Have I decided upon it as the organization? And how I make it happen is my lived experience. How do I do this? Well, I'm kind of considerate. Well, I'm bolshy and I'm aggressive, or I include people or I exclude people. So I think there can be sometimes an external and internal focus, if you like, or a business and a personal focus on those things. One of the things for me that's interesting is the relationship sometimes that people generate, not because it's the best way to do it, but simply because it's the way that they tend to function. So in terms of relationships, I see a lot of people focus on action and purpose. And what that means is, why do I do what I do? Well, because, it's what I do for a living, or it's my job, or I was told to do it. I see you doing this thing, and you do this thing again and again and again and again. Why are you doing that? Well, because, that's the way I've always done it. So action and purpose often form, quite close bedfellows, if you like,
Mm,
in terms of relationships. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means if that's the strongest narrative that you have, or that's the thing that's most clearly expected from you, account for your actions. Tell me why you're doing what you do, John. Then that's the thing that people are going to refer to. With any of these relationships that are more distinct than others, if that means that other facets or other relationships are neglected, then they just sit there and either develop like an unconscious bias, if you like, or they don't get as much airtime as they need. And it's like, working with one arm tied behind your back. If you know what you do and why you're doing it, but you haven't got a clue how you're going to make it happen, and there's no real plan to help you execute it, then those things become chance rather than design.
mm,
Other relationships that come about, again, plans and outcomes. I think many businesses are focused on that relationship. These are the outcomes we need, and this is what you need to do, people. This is what the plan is. And I think that can become a very, very clear narrative from a business perspective. And again, if it doesn't help people understand what their purpose is, if it doesn't support them in their strategic way of going about achieving that outcome or making that plan come to life, if those things aren't important for the business, but they are important for the individual, there's a massive gap in terms of helping it to come to life. So let's have a look at what this means in reality.
yeah, because I was just
When
going
we
to
work with people.
just ask you a question on that one, Will, before you move on further. So is what you're saying in this is so you could start from any point on this in terms of you were exploring with, let's say, a team who would you know engaging on a project or something that they could start from the outcome place and get absolute clarity and simplicity on that, and then backtrack through the other five facets to get clarity on what they need to do to get to the outcome. Similarly, you're saying they could have a very clear plan, but haven't given much attention to the style in which they're going to go about the
Yeah.
plan, or why they want to do that in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, if I was working with this on a team and we were coming to it with a blank slate, I would absolutely say to them, which of these speaks the loudest to you,
Right, right.
and get them to define it.
Mm,
And they might say, oh, it's purpose, it's absolutely purpose, or it's strategy, or it's reputation, and then work around that, and then develop, potentially a cycle or relationships between, whatever you want to use it. This
mm,
is. Somebody asked me about this recently. They said, "What is this again?" And I said, "It's an instrument. It's like a violin. It's got strings and there's a bow and there's a body and there's a fret and all that sort of stuff. Depending on what you want to do with it and the tune you want to play is going to be dependent on how you practice it. The tuition that you get to learn how to use it, the tune that you want to play. And it's exactly the same with this. So, what speaks the loudest to you? This does, that does, the other does. Which relationship speaks the loudest? But as you say, if I work with an organization that says we have a clearly defined challenge, a clearly defined issue or problem, the first question I'm going to say to them is, okay, what's the problem? Let's get that nailed. What's the out? If you solve this, what would be the outcome of that? What would be the result, the measurable result? So you're absolutely right. Start with the outcome. And then I would work backwards and say, okay, so why do you want to achieve that? What's the purpose that underpins it?
why is that important?
Organizationally, yeah, why is it important? Okay, how are you going to do that? What's in place? Are you going to tickle people with feathers? Or are you going to, put some new measures in place in terms of how people communicate? How are you going to make sure you achieve this? What's the plan in place and who's responsible for what in terms of committing to actions? And what would this say about us? So you could look at that as a cycle, if you like, and working different ways around it. Ultimately, if you were to look at where you weight the practical nature of it, if you were to put this as a triangle, not in terms of hierarchy, but just in terms of volume, you would have actions at the bottom and then plan, strategy, purpose, outcome, and reputation at the top of the triangle. And if you don't have enough actions to support the plan and the strategy, then it becomes a little imbalanced.
Mm.
What I've done is draw out a couple of slides to finish with.
Yeah, because I think that would be
But
probably the thing that there's a couple of questions here from people asking, the model looks great, and can see that there's a need to sort of generate sort of cultures of sort of psychological safety where people feel willing to take that ownership. But how would you practically use this model, tomorrow if you were going to take that back into a team that were about to embark on a project or something?
Yes, I mean that's a great question in terms of a culture of safety. If people don't feel safe in exploring, and they think there's mixed messages or another agenda going on, people get very, very nervous about it. And I think one of the things in terms of choosing to own the experience you're about to enter into and be accountable for it, and know that it's not going to be thrown back at you, so you are safe, is being able to predict the future. And predicting the future sounds lovely, but if you can do it because you've made considerable efforts to think about what that means you're going to do tomorrow morning, how that sits in terms of the overarching plan, and you've got the tools, techniques, and skills to know how you can make it come about, and you know why, what's driving it, what's driving you, and you know how you measure this, that knowledge of that potential narrative for you is something that creates an end-to-end story.
Yeah.
And if you can navigate through this story, knowing all the time that you've considered elements, features, and facets of it, the difference between that and moving into a new period of whatever you're doing with hope that it's going to go well, hope that you're going to be supported, hope that it turns out right, it's very, very different than knowing that you've put things in place that give you consistent reference points that you can either hit or change or redefine. Once you've designed a particular journey, it doesn't mean you have to stick to it. It might just be the reference point. You might redesign it. What I've done here for these last two slides is just look at what you might call so the ownership paradigm in practice from a personal perspective and from a team perspective. Taking these from a couple of clients that I've worked with, obviously anonymized. And when we've worked with these, this has been much more developmental, if you like. So looking at, from a personal perspective, how to really upskill themselves in particular areas. So these 6 facets we talked about, and the 2 columns, we didn't just come up with one particular feature in each column. There would have been, I don't know, anything between 7, 10 to 15 or 20 different ingredients in each of these. So in terms of outcomes, raising self-awareness.
So what we've got here is just one thread, just to illustrate how you would have captured it.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so if you say, for instance, if you had 10 things in each facet, you've got 60 different things that are the ingredients that you're working with, everything from actions through to reputation. They're considerations, thoughts, goals, aspirations, things you currently do, things you want to do more of, things you want to do less of. And then you can just navigate your way through saying, how do they relate to each other? So if this one facet, this one element here, one ingredient relates to that then relates to something else in the next one, you can plot different journeys, and you can make it as stretching or as obvious or as challenging or as different as you want in order to create the stretch.
And typically, do you find that as people flesh these out, that at this, I know we've sort of put them in order here, starting with action, going down to reputation, but do you tend to find there are probably more things that go into the actions because there's lots of specific things, and probably in reputation and outcomes there'd be a smaller number of options? Is that how it tends to work?
Well, I think you can engineer it. You don't have to, but you might find that there's loads of outcomes you're looking for, and actually there's 2 actions you want to put into place. Typically, I think people generate more actions simply because there are more practical things that can be being done.
Yeah.
You can do stuff, you can talk, you can behave, you can engage. So there's lots of actual tangible things. And of course, with actions, you can break it down to ever smaller elements. Is it the way I come up and shake your hand, or is it the meeting that we organise, or is it, an action to introduce a new method of working? So they can be as small or as large as you like. Whereas when you start to get to the purpose and the reputation, and to some degree the outcomes, they might be more conceptual. I understand that outcomes often are results that you would measure, but in terms of raising self-awareness, how am I going to measure that? Well, practically, I need to think about what actions I need to take to be able to do that. So I'm good. Rather than talk through these, I'm going to assume that people can read them and will have read those. We'll just put the last slide up now, which is the one in terms of teams. And again, you can see that from the one on the left-hand side, so the outcome was to increase agility in response to the market and to win more quality work. So it's a really tangible outcome But would that team necessarily have come up with the action that was the most important one, which is to book in one-to-one interviews with each team member in the next 30 days? Well, possibly, but actually it was such a simple one to generate that action. It was so obvious when we did this that people just said, well, that obviously is the one we need to do, because there's no other way we're going to learn what matters to each team member unless we do that. So it reduced the amount of time where people spent sitting there brainstorming using no framework, I mean, this was produced in probably an hour and a half, 2 hours, just as a start point for a workshop.
Well, I'm conscious of time because we've sort of gone over the sort of 45 minutes, and I said we'd do some questions. So I've just got a couple here that I think would be interesting to hear your thoughts on. So there's a couple along similar lines. People said around they sort of can see the simplicity of it in terms of the questions that are being asked, but in what ways do you practically use it? This is a tool, as an instrument, and who, with, and how.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I coach a lot of people in business, and I would often use this as a start point for a conversation, in a coaching conversation, if it was useful for them. If we were exploring and we were trying to find, along themes of journeys and narratives, that they were trying to work out how to create some clarity around those. And sometimes I might use this as a distinct tool. I might bring it in and bring in a copy of this and get them to start to populate different features of it. We might use a particular challenge that they're experiencing and start to flesh out where they were spending more time and attention, where they were spending less. And so that's one way of using it as a coaching tool, if you like. The other one is using it, as I talked about, with teams. I do this with a lot of teams in order that they get to share their thoughts and observations around each of these different facets. And it's always interesting when people perceive them to be completely different. The usual challenge within most teams is that people lump the purpose and the outcomes in the same bucket, and they try and explain and argue and justify why one is the other and one is the other, and it's hard sometimes to really define it. And maybe there isn't an absolute, but if the purpose and the outcome are just put together in one conversation, pulling them apart and really understanding what the component parts are of them is critical. Equally, plan and strategy often get dumped into exactly the same category, and it's hard to work out what they are.
Well, that probably leads into the final question. Actually, there's one here around. Are there any, in your experience, are there any particular challenges that individuals or teams find in going through this process?
Yeah, they find it challenging. Full stop. For something that is so simple, and as you well know, to get something down to 6 words that didn't produce an absolute outcome, it was just a stimulation tool. To get it down to 6 words has taken seemingly years, because it's the simplicity of it that creates the challenge, because it's not saying anything's right or wrong. And yeah, this creates a huge amount of agitation for people, but I mean in a positive way, some agitation.
Yeah.
And in the same way that if somebody asked me to play the violin, that would cause me an awful lot of agitation and probably some anxiety as well. And the one thing that I know is that if you can help people work with this, if you can guide them through it, and it is a coaching tool, and in the same way that just showing somebody the GROW model, for instance, doesn't mean that they're a good coach, using this as a tool and saying, right, off you go, people, just answer these questions, that in itself isn't going to produce necessarily the best outcome for that individual or for that team. My thinking is in terms of using this, I help people to learn how to help themselves. So I work with a lot of teams where I help them to understand how to use this as a tool, as an instrument, so that they can then use that for themselves with their teams. But the initial, how do you get the depth and the breadth and the reach with this? Yeah, it's a real challenge, because it requires challenging thinking, challenging behavior. It requires people to debate and to explore, to be highly personal and relate that back to business. And to take this right back to where we started, if you can have people clearly populate this and do it from an emotional perspective, a psychological perspective, a relational perspective, a behavioral perspective, if they are authoring each of these facets and all the ingredients that sit in there, and they can identify for themselves what are the meaningful and critical parts of that journey, that's theirs and they own it. They've decided upon this. They've defined it. They've decided that the future needs to look like this, and that's the thing that's going to guide them through. And if they do that, then they own the experience, which is very different than somebody else deciding upon all of this for them and saying, and we'll hold you accountable to it.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, I think we've hit the full stops on the time there, Will. So thanks so much for that presentation. I know you and I have discussed this a lot before, but I've even going through it again, I found that really interesting, and I think it generates so many more conversations in teams and organisations. So as you say, it's a great instrument for people to create more simplicity and clarity around any issue they're working through, whether that's at an individual, team, or organisational level. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for listening as well. As I said at the start, we have recorded this and we'll send that out to you. So that's both a recording of the audio and the slide deck. So some people have asked about that. So no problem there. If you've already registered, we'll be sending it on out to you. And if it has generated any further questions that we haven't covered off about how you might engage with this, then please do get in touch, and we'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you about it. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Take care. Bye now.